Imagine a crown, not as a shimmering symbol of glory in a museum, but as a cold, heavy circle of iron and gold, resting silently on a dark oak bedside table in the deep velvet dead of night. Outside, the year is 1150, and the world is vastly different from the one you just left behind. The stone walls of the castle are thick, breathing with the damp chill of the evening mist that rolls off the distant moors. You are safe here. You are hidden behind 3 feet of ancient, solid granite, where the frantic noise and the weight of the modern world simply cannot find you. The air carries the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and old beeswax, a lingering memory of the day's rituals now surrendered to the shadows. Close your eyes now, and let the flickering neon lights of the present dissolve. Let the restless hum of technology fade into the rhythmic hiss of a single torch burning low in a wall sconce. We are stepping into a time where silence was the ultimate luxury, and power was a gilded prison. Tonight, we are not merely observing the past from a distance. We are breathing it. We are becoming part of the stillness that once belonged to the most powerful people on earth. Feel the heavy texture of the velvet curtains as they are drawn tight against the silver moonlight, sealing out the wind. Listen to the rhythmic, distant pulse of a sentry's boots on the stone ramparts far above, a steady, reassuring beat that has echoed for 1,000 years to ensure that within these walls, you are protected. Within these walls, you can finally let go. To be a king or a queen in the Middle Ages was to live a life of magnificent, quiet strangeness. Every movement they made was a choreographed ritual. Every breath they took was a matter of state. Yet, as the fire in the great hearth settles into a soft amber glow of dying embers, we begin to see the hidden truth. Beyond the heraldry, beyond the shimmering silks and the sharp swords, there were only human beings. They were weary from the weight of their crowns, seeking the same profound peace that is now washing over you, inch by inch, from your toes to your tired mind. We are about to travel through the secret, echoing corridors of history. We will walk beside Eleanor in her ambition and stand in the silent snow with Matilda. But for now, there is no throne to claim. There is no kingdom left to defend. There is only the vast, comforting darkness, the scent of old parchment, and the steady, slow heartbeat of a history that is ready to sing you to sleep. The weight of the day is lifting, replaced by the weight of the tapestry on the walls. You are becoming a ghost in these halls, unnoticed and unburdened. The iron key turns with a heavy, satisfying thud in the lock of time, and the great wooden door to the past opens silently, just for you. As we leave the flickering light of the bedside behind, we move deeper into the heart of the fortress, where the stone itself seems to hold the dreams of those who came before. The journey is long, the night is deep, and the story is just beginning to unfold in the quiet corners of your mind. Follow the shadow of the candle flame. Follow the trail of silk on stone. We are moving toward the center of the castle, toward the very soul of the medieval world, where the secrets of royalty are kept in the palm of the night. Sleep is the only crown you need tonight, and the kingdom of rest is already yours to command. Let the words drift like smoke. Let the history settle like dust. We are going back into the soft gray light of a world forgotten by the sun. The corridor stretches out before you, a long arched spine of silver gray stone that seems to have no beginning and no end. Your footsteps make no sound as you move, as if the very air of the 11th century is cushioning your stride, wrapping your feet in a silent, invisible velvet. To your left and right, the walls are vast and cool, built from heavy monumental blocks of granite that have stood unmoved while empires rose and fell outside in the chaotic light of day. There is a profound sense of weight here, but it is not a weight that crushes or confines. Instead, it is a weight that protects. It is the solid, unyielding embrace of a fortress designed to keep the restlessness of the world at bay, creating a sanctuary where time itself seems to slow down and breathe. As you walk, the light from the iron wall sconces plays a slow, hypnotic game with the shadows. The orange glow of the burning pitch licks at the edges of the darkness, creating amber patterns that dance like silk ribbons against the rough-hewn rock. There is no rush here. The castle does not care for the frantic ticking of modern clocks or the urgent demands of the sun. It breathes in centuries, it dreams in decades, and it invites you to do the same. Pause for a long moment and draw in a deep, slow breath. The air is thin and crisp, carrying the unmistakable grounding scent of the medieval world. It is a subtle blend of dried lavender and sweet woodruff strewn across the floorboards to soften the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of cold iron and the earthy, ancient aroma of damp stone. It is a scent that pulls you deeper into the earth, anchoring your senses to the present moment and letting the outside world dissolve. You can almost feel the texture of the environment against your skin. There is the slight, refreshing chill of the draft that wanders through the high, narrow arrow slits, and the contrasting warmth of the thick, hand-woven wool tapestries that line the stone walls. These tapestries are heavy with history, their dense fibers muffling every stray sound until the entire universe becomes a soft, muffled sanctuary. Feel the phantom weight of a heavy wool blanket draped over your shoulders, its natural oils and thick weave providing a shield of warmth that makes the cool air of the hall feel like a gentle, loving caress. In this liminal space, you begin to notice something peculiar about the silence. It is not the empty, hollow silence of a vacuum, but a thick, textured quiet that feels almost physical, like a soft layer of dust settling over a library. In our modern lives, we are used to the constant, jagged background radiation of hums, engines, and distant electricity. But here, the silence is profound and absolute. It is a deep, resonant stillness that is somehow louder and more present than any modern city. It is the sound of a building that has forgotten how to hurry, a monument to the slow passage of existence. You can hear the microscopic crackle of the torch wick as it slowly consumes the wax, a sound so delicate and intimate that it would be lost in any other era. You can hear the long, low sigh of the wind as it brushes against the exterior battlements miles away, yet it feels close, like a giant breathing in its sleep right beside you. This silence is a gift. It is the natural rhythm of the soul, a signal to your nervous system that for tonight, there are no alarms to heed, no screens to watch, and no messages to answer. You are a guest of the stones, and the stones do not demand anything from you. They only hold you in their quiet, eternal strength. As you reach the far end of the long gallery, your attention is drawn to a single, tall beeswax candle, sitting in a niche carved directly into the heart of the rock. The flame is a steady, golden teardrop, barely flickering in the still, heavy air. Watch the center of that flame closely. See the deep, sapphire blue at its very heart, shifting slowly into a vibrant, translucent amber at the edges. It is rhythmic, pulsing ever so slightly with a life of its own, mirroring the slow beat of your own heart. As you stare into the glow, your vision begins to soften and blur. The sharp edges of the stone wall fade away, and the world outside this small, warm circle of light ceases to exist entirely. There is only the light, the warmth, and the deepening, comforting pull of the shadows. The candle is a silent sentinel, marking the ancient boundary between the public halls of the castle and the private, sacred sanctums of those who ruled this world. Your heartbeat begins to sync perfectly with the slow, steady flicker of the wick. 1, 2, 3, a cadence of absolute peace that carries you toward the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Behind that door, the air changes. It becomes warmer, more intimate, thick with the presence of a life lived at the very height of human existence, yet sheltered from its storms. We are no longer in the transitional, echoing spaces of the fortress. We are approaching the inner sanctum, the place where the heavy crown is finally laid down and the ego is allowed to rest. The scent of lavender grows stronger here, mixed now with the expensive, resinous perfume of frankincense and the sweet, herbal smell of fresh rushes. You can hear the very faint, rhythmic breathing of someone on the other side, a soft, human sound that reminds us that even in this monumental world of cold stone and sharp iron, it was the fragile human heart that gave the castle its soul. We are standing on the threshold of a royal morning, prepared to witness the strange, choreographed dance of a world where even a king's first waking thought was a performance for the heavens. The door is immense, bound in black iron and weathered by centuries, but it yields to your touch with a soft, welcoming groan of ancient wood. We are stepping inside now, moving away from the cold granite and into the golden, flickering warmth of the royal bedchamber, where the story of the day begins in the quietest of ways. The first light of the medieval morning does not crash into the room. It arrives as a soft, hesitant ghost of pale gray and muted gold. It filters through the high, narrow windows, catching the dancing dust motes that have hung suspended in the absolute stillness of the night. This light slowly, almost imperceptibly, travels across the expanse of the room, illuminating the intricate, ancient threads of the great tapestries that line the stone walls, bringing to life the silent hunters, the stiff-petaled flowers, and the frozen noble hounds of the weave. The air in the royal bedchamber is thick and heavy, with the lingering warmth of the evening's hearth, and the comforting, sweet scent of old wood smoke and melted beeswax. Outside, the world is beginning its slow stir, a distant rooster's crow, the muffled metallic clatter of a wooden bucket in the stone courtyard. But inside this cocoon of granite and velvet, time remains suspended in a state of nostalgic, heavy warmth. There is a profound, deep comfort in this quiet beginning, a sense of safety that comes from the predictable rhythm of a ritual that has been performed for 1,000 years. It is a cadence that grounds the soul, a steady pulse of tradition that prepares the mind before the heavy weight of the crown is ever felt upon the brow. As the king begins to stir beneath his layers of heavy furs and quilted blankets, the room quietly, almost invisibly, fills with people. In our modern world, the morning is a private sanctuary, a fleeting time for solitude and the slow gathering of one's own thoughts. But for a medieval monarch, the morning was a beautifully choreographed public event known as the levee. Imagine waking from a deep, dreamless sleep to find a dozen of your most trusted subjects already present in the shadows, their movements as silent and fluid as water. There is no jarring noise, no sudden movement. Only the rhythmic, soothing rustle of fine bleached linen, and the soft, repetitive padding of leather-soled shoes on the fresh, fragrant rushes strewn across the floor. The process of rising is a slow, multi-layered ceremony of touch and care. First comes the fine linen chemise, cool and crisp against the warm skin, followed by layer upon layer of soft wool, shimmering silk, and heavy, ornate brocade. Each garment is a deliberate gesture of status, handed to the monarch by a different nobleman in a sequence that feels like a slow-motion dance. To be dressed by a duke or a count was not an act of simple servitude, but a highly coveted sacred honor. There is a strange paradoxical intimacy in this moment. The king is the most powerful man in his world, yet he is as quiet and as cared for as a child, allowing the hands of others to tie his intricate laces and smooth the heavy folds of his sleeves. This is the human connection that the stone monuments often hide, the shared, silent vulnerability between a ruler and those who serve him in the dim, golden light of the dawn. Perhaps the most bizarre, and yet most profoundly intimate of these royal roles, was that of the groom of the stool. In a world where every royal action was a grand performance for the public eye, even the most basic and humble of human necessities were transformed into a ritual of state. The groom of the stool was responsible for the king's most physical, private needs, a position that required him to be constantly present during the monarch's most unguarded moments. While it may seem unusual or even undignified to a modern ear, this was in fact one of the most powerful and envied positions in the entire castle. Because he was there when the king was at his most human and his most vulnerable, the groom became a trusted confidant, a keeper of the deepest secrets, and a silent observer of the real man who lived behind the rigid mask of majesty. In these quiet early hours, the king was not a god-appointed ruler of millions. He was simply a person, subject to the same biological realities and the same slow morning grogginess as any peasant sleeping in the hay of the fields. The safety of the bedchamber lies in this shared, undeniable humanity. Within these thick walls, the grand political schemes and the bloody wars of Europe felt infinitely far away, replaced by the simple, repetitive, and peaceful reality of being physically cared for by another human being in the silence. The room is now fully awake, though the atmosphere remains hushed, heavy, and deeply reverent. The expensive resinous scent of frankincense begins to rise from a swinging silver censer, mingling with the earthy smell of warm, crusty bread being brought in on a heavy wooden trencher. You can hear the soft, melodic, and hypnotic clinking of a gold ewer against a silver basin as warm water is poured for the royal wash. It is a sound like a small underground spring hidden in a cave, repetitive and lulling to the ears. Every action is a protective layer, a way of building the royal persona piece by piece, fabric by fabric, before it must step out to face the judgment of the world. There is no urgency here, no frantic rushing toward the heavy demands of the coming day. The ritual is designed to expand time, to allow the royal mind to settle deeply into its heavy role. As the last jewel is carefully pinned, and the last fur-lined cloak is draped over the broad shoulders, the king stands at the center of the room, a magnificent, gilded statue of power. Yet, if you look closely into the flickering, orange torchlight, you can still see the slight, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, the steady, quiet pulse in his neck. He is a person of flesh and blood, momentarily encased in the beautiful golden armor of tradition. The deep silence of the room is now textured by the soft, sweeping sound of silk brushing against the stone floor. A gentle, rhythmic sound that follows the king as he begins his slow move toward the great oak doors. It is the sound of a transition, the sound of the private soul becoming a public icon. The lingering warmth of the bedchamber is about to be traded for the cold, echoing, and vast expanse of the great hall. The safety of the inner sanctum is becoming a memory now, a golden light to be held in the secret heart and carried through the long, demanding, and weary hours that lie ahead. We stand here on the threshold of the room, watching the grand procession slowly form in the shadows. The nobility fall silently into line, their own heavy silk robes echoing the rhythmic sound of the king's path. The morning ritual is complete, the mask of state is firmly in place, and the divine right to rule is ready to be displayed to the waiting world. As the heavy doors swing open on their iron hinges, a blast of cooler, crisper air from the gallery rushes in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the very distant, haunting sound of a lone trumpet. We leave the hushed, warm intimacy of the morning behind and step out into the vast, bright, and echoing theater of the royal court, where the eyes of the realm are waiting for the performance of power to begin. Over the threshold we go, leaving the safety of the bed for the grandeur of the stone. As we leave the hushed intimacy of the royal bedchamber, we step into the vast, echoing lungs of the castle, the grand hall. The sheer scale of this space is designed to make the human soul feel small, yet shielded and secure. High above, the vaulted timber ceiling disappears into a haze of blue wood smoke, where the massive oak beams are stained dark by centuries of warmth and celebration. The air here is thick, heavy, and intoxicating, a dense tapestry of scents that hit the senses in slow, rhythmic waves. You can smell the sharp, metallic tang of the cold stone walls, but it is overwhelmed by the rich, fatty aroma of roasted swan and wild boar glistening over the great hearth. Beneath your feet, the floor is carpeted in a thick, cushioning layer of fresh, green rushes and sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet and winter mint. As the nobility move, these herbs are crushed beneath their weight, releasing a bright, cooling fragrance that cuts through the heavy smell of roasting meat and the smoky, resinous scent of flickering tallow candles. This is the sensory fullness of the medieval world, a place where every breath is a reminder of the wealth and the raw power of the crown. It is a world of abundance, designed to occupy every corner of the mind until the worries of the outside world simply cease to exist. Imagine taking your place at a long, heavy trestle table carved from ancient, weathered English oak. Hee! Ah! The wood is cool and smooth beneath your hands, polished by the velvet sleeves of countless guests who sat here in the centuries before you. The dining room of a king was not merely a place to eat. It was a silent theater of status, a carefully calibrated map of power where every object held a hidden meaning. The most significant of these was the salt. At the center of the high table, placed directly in front of the king, sat a magnificent ornate vessel of silver or gold known as the nef. It was shaped like a grand sailing ship, and within its hull lay the white gold of the Middle Ages, pure salt. Where you sat in relation to this vessel defined your entire existence within the court. To be above the salt was to be in the inner circle of the sun, warmed by the direct light of royal favor. To be below the salt was to be a shadow, a mere observer of a feast you were barely a part of. The etiquette was as rigid as the stone walls themselves. One did not simply eat, one performed a social ritual. There were specific ways to hold a knife, specific ways to break bread with 3 fingers, and a silent, sophisticated language of gestures that signaled to the army of servants exactly when to pour the spiced wine or clear the silver trenchers. The food itself was a parade of the impossible, a collection of culinary paradoxes meant to dazzle the eye as much as the palate. Imagine a peacock brought to the table, its skin carefully sewn back onto the roasted meat, its magnificent tail feathers fanned out in a shimmering, iridescent arc of emerald and sapphire. There were subtleties, intricate sculptures made of sugar and almond paste that depicted entire castles, saints, or scenes of chivalry, so beautiful they seemed a sin to consume. But the true secret of the royal feast lay in the invisible. As you lift a chalice of sweetened wine to your lips, you taste the warmth of cinnamon, the bite of ginger, and the floral ghost of saffron. In the 11th and 12th centuries, these spices were more than just flavor. They were more valuable than human lives. A single pound of nutmeg could buy a small farm. A handful of peppercorns was worth a soldier's yearly wage. To consume these spices was to consume the very essence of the distant, mysterious East. It was a display of reach, a way of showing that the king's hand stretched across oceans and deserts to bring the heat of the sun to a cold stone hall in Europe. To eat was to perform an act of conquest, one bite at a time. As the hours of the feast stretch on, the frantic energy of the day begins to settle into a heavy, wine-soaked lethargy. The great hall, once a theater of booming voices and clashing silver, grows softer and more blurred at the edges. The light from the massive hearth fire begins to die down, turning from a fierce yellow to a deep, pulsating crimson that glows like a heartbeat. The high-backed chairs seem to grow larger and more encompassing, as the guests lean back into the soft furs and heavy velvets of their finery. You can hear the rhythmic, repetitive sound of the carver's knife against the wood, a steady beat that acts as a metronome for the fading evening. There is a profound sense of fullness here, not just of the stomach, but of the spirit. The mind is so saturated with the detail of the tapestries, the scent of the herbs, and the complex heat of the spices that it can no longer hold on to the anxieties of the future or the regrets of the past. You are anchored here, in this golden, smoky moment, protected by the sheer physical weight of the ritual. The world outside the castle walls, with its poverty and its cold, feels like a dream that happened to someone else. Here, under the watchful eyes of the stone gargoyles, there is only the warmth and the slow, steady passage of the night. The music, which has been a constant background hum of harps and flutes, begins to change its character as the candles burn low. A lone minstrel seated in the deep shadows of the gallery begins to play a lute. The notes are sparse, silver and clear, falling through the heavy air like drops of cold water into a still, dark pool. The melody does not demand your attention. It simply braids itself into the silence that is slowly reclaiming the room. As the lute's song drifts and fades, the echoes seem to wander up into the darkened rafters, losing themselves in the lingering smoke. The laughter of the guests becomes a low, indistinct murmur, a soft tide of sound that ebbs and flows with the flickering of the remaining candles. One by one, The torches are extinguished, and the vibrant colors of the peacock feathers and the gold plate dissolve into shades of indigo and charcoal. The sensory feast is concluding, leaving behind a lingering sense of awe and a physical heaviness in the limbs that makes moving feel like an impossible task. The performance is over, and the masks of the courtiers begin to slip in the safety of the shadows. But, as the last note of the lute hangs suspended in the air, a different kind of silence settles over the great hall. It is a sharper, more watchful quiet that lies beneath the surface of the lethargy. The music was a shield, a beautiful way to drown out the whispers that always haunt the halls of power. When the music stops, the real business of the crown begins in the dark. In the dim light, figures begin to lean toward one another, their voices dropping to a frequency that the thick stone walls seem to soak up like ink on parchment. The grand sensory overload of the banquet was a beautiful distraction, a gilded curtain drawn over the cold, hard machinery of politics. Now that the belly is full, and the mind is dazed by spice and song, the games of shadow and breath commence. We move from the public splendor of the feast toward the quiet, dangerous corners of the castle, where a single whispered word can change the fate of a kingdom. The warmth of the hall remains, but a chill of anticipation begins to stir in the draughts that dance near the floor. We follow the shadows as they creep toward the private galleries, leaving the remnants of the swan and the salt behind in the dark. As you leave the lingering warmth and the fading echoes of the great hall, the atmosphere shifts with a sudden cooling grace. You are moving away from the physical world, the world of roasted meats, sharp spices, and political whispers, and stepping into the spiritual heart of the fortress, the royal chapel. The transition is profound. The air here does not smell of smoke or salt. Instead, it is thin, crisp, and carries the ancient holy scent of cold frankincense and damp limestone. The heavy carved oak doors click shut behind you with a sound that seems to sever your connection to the material realm entirely. Here, the silence is not just a lack of noise, but a presence in itself, a thick velvet curtain that demands a different kind of breathing, a slower, deeper rhythm. The stone floor beneath your feet is no longer covered in soft rushes, but is bare, polished to a dull silver sheen by centuries of kneeling kings and weeping queens. Every step you take produces a faint, rhythmic echo that travels up the high, narrow walls toward the vaulted ceiling, where the shadows gather like silent monks in eternal prayer. In this hushed sanctuary, the true nature of medieval royalty reveals itself in the dim light. To the world outside, the monarch was a figure of terrifying, absolute power. But within these consecrated walls, they occupied a strange, liminal space. They were the divine right, the living bridge between the chaotic, muddy earth and the eternal golden heavens. Imagine the king sitting in the carved stone gallery, looking down at the altar as the moonlight bleeds through the stained glass windows, casting long, bruised shadows of indigo, violet, and deep crimson across the cold floor. He was told from the very moment of his birth that his blood was different, that his hand was guided by the Creator himself. This was the veil of faith, a psychological armor that justified every tax, every war, and every execution performed in his name. It was a heavy spiritual burden to carry, a constant whispering reminder that while he ruled over millions of men, he was ultimately accountable to a much higher, much more terrifying judge. The chapel was where the king came to be reminded that his crown was merely a temporary loan from God, a brief, flickering glitter in the vast, dark, and silent ocean of eternity. Underneath the heavy fur-lined robes and the glittering jeweled collars, the reality of the monarch was far simpler and more fragile than the world ever knew. In the flickering low light of the votive candles, the king was just a man deeply, perhaps even desperately, terrified of the afterlife. The Middle Ages were an era where heaven and hell were not abstract concepts or distant metaphors, but physical places as real as the stone walls of the castle itself. Every royal action was shadowed by the fear of purgatory, by the immense weight of sins that could not be washed away by gold or silver. In the deep silence of the chapel, away from the flattering tongues of courtiers and the clashing of swords, the king faced the same existential dread that visits all of us in the quietest hours of the night. He was a creature of clay and breath, haunted by the fragility of his own life and the vastness of the silence that awaited him at the end of his reign. This vulnerability is the secret heart of history. It is the realization that the most powerful figures in our past were often the most haunted, driven by a profound need for divine approval that they could never quite be sure they had truly obtained. The silence of the chapel begins to take on a musical quality, a soft, vibrating hum that seems to emerge from the very stone itself. In the distance, perhaps in a neighboring monastery or a hidden alcove of the cathedral, a choir of monks begins to practice a Gregorian chant. The sound is a single monophonic line of music, no harmony to distract, no rhythm to jar the senses, just a steady flowing river of collective human breath. It is a sound that does not ask for anything. It simply exists, rising and falling like the chest of a deep sleeper. The Latin words are unintelligible to the modern ear, but their intent is clear. They are a lullaby for the soul, a way to smooth out the jagged, sharp edges of the day's anxieties. The music wraps around the cold stone pillars and drifts through the incense-laden air, creating a cocoon of spiritual calm that shields you from the world. Your own breath begins to slow in perfect sympathy with the chant. The weight of your limbs feels as heavy as the stone saints carved into the walls, sinking deeper and deeper into a state of profound meditative stillness, where the past and the present become one. As the last lingering notes of the chant dissolve into the shadows of the high rafters, the spiritual focus of the castle begins to shift once more. We have seen the king as a ruler of men and as a humble servant of God, but history is not woven solely by the hands of kings. The veil of faith was powerful, but there were those whose spirits were too vast to be contained even by the dictates of the church or the rigid laws of the realm. A different kind of energy is stirring in the quiet corners of the past, a feminine power that was both devout and daring, graceful and fierce. The light in the chapel is fading now, and the scent of frankincense is being slowly replaced by the fresh smell of rain-washed roses and the worn leather of a traveler's saddle. We are moving away from the stone altar and toward the open road, toward a story that spans continents and defies the expectations of an entire age. We are about to meet a woman who challenged the heavens themselves, a queen who redefined what it meant to wear a crown in a world of men. We turn our gaze toward the darkening horizon, toward the rising legend of Eleanor. Close your eyes and let the cold, gray stone of the northern cathedrals fade into a different kind of light, a light that feels like a warm, golden hand pressing gently against your brow. Imagine a land where the sun is a constant companion, where the air is thick and sweet with the scent of ripening purple grapes, wild mountain thyme, and the bracing salt of the Atlantic breeze. This is Aquitaine, in the lush south of France, a realm of wandering poets, sprawling ancient forests, and sun-drenched hills that roll toward the horizon like waves. In the year 1122, a girl was born here who would not just inherit this vast land, but embody its fierce, independent, and unyielding spirit. Her name was Eleanor. She was born to own the horizon, to command the very air she breathed, while other noble daughters of her time were being taught to lower their eyes, to fold their hands in silence, and to remain as still as shadows in the drafty halls of their fathers. Eleanor was riding through the golden dust of the southern roads. She was learning the melodic art of the troubadours and the complex, dangerous chess games of power. She was the greatest heiress in all of Europe, a woman whose dowry was an entire kingdom of sun and soil. But in the rigid world of the Middle Ages, such a massive fortune was a heavy, treacherous burden for a woman to carry alone. It made her a prize to be hunted, a shimmering jewel to be locked away in the dark treasury of a king. At the tender and vulnerable age of 15, the vibrant, sun-drenched world of Eleanor was suddenly traded for the cold, damp, and unforgiving mists of Paris. She was married to Louis VII, the King of France, a man who had been painstakingly raised for the silence of the monastery rather than the clamor of the throne. Imagine the stark contrast that settled into her soul. Eleanor was a creature of light, music, and laughter, accustomed to the free-spirited, open courts of the South. Louis was a man of long shadows, deep fasts, and endless, whispered prayers. A king who wore a rough hair shirt beneath his fine royal silk to punish his own flesh. For 15 long gray years, Eleanor lived in the drafty, echoing halls of the Sight Palace, watching the endless Parisian rain streak like tears against the narrow stone windows. She famously remarked to her closest confidants that she had married a monk, not a king. The boredom was a physical weight, a slow, silent erosion of her vibrant spirit that lasted for more than a decade. But Eleanor was not a woman built for kneeling in the dark or for fading away into the stone. While the French court whispered about her southern vanities and her strange foreign ways, she was quietly feeding a fire within herself, waiting with a predator's patience for a chance to break the gilded bars of her royal cage. She did not just want to be a queen in name or a vessel for an heir. She wanted to be a primary player on the great stage of the world, to feel the sharp wind of history blowing against her face. That long-awaited chance finally arrived with the sounding of the silver trumpets for the Second Crusade. While the bishops preached of holy sacrifice and the knights sharpened their cold steel in the courtyards, Eleanor did something that shook the very foundations of medieval Christendom. She did not stay behind to pray in the cold, silent Parisian cathedrals as was expected of a queen. Instead, she boldly announced that she, as the Duchess of Aquitaine, would lead her own vassals and her own army to the Holy Land. The legends of the time tell of a magnificent, almost mythical sight that scorched itself into the memory of the people. Eleanor and 300 of her finest noble ladies, allegedly dressed in the shimmering armor of Amazons, riding white horses through the gates of the city of Paris. They wore flowing tunics over their fine mail, their long hair unbound and catching the sunlight like spun gold. It was a spectacular and dangerous act of defiance, a visual declaration to the world that she would never be left in the small footnotes of history. She took her court of ladies across the treacherous, snow-capped mountains of Anatolia and into the searing, absolute heat of the east, trading the suffocating safety of her palace for the biting dust of the road and the beautiful uncertainty of the desert night. The journey was a long, rhythmic cycle of sun and shifting sand that seemed to stretch into eternity, pulling her further from the woman she used to be. Imagine the sound of thousands of horse hooves striking the dry, sun-baked earth of the Levant, a steady, hypnotic, and low thudding that became the very heartbeat of her life for months on end. The nights in the east were not like the nights in France. The stars felt closer, larger, burning with a fierce cold intensity over the black, silent silhouettes of the ancient cedar trees. Eleanor sat by the low campfires, the smell of wood smoke and bitter coffee filling the cool night air, listening to the strange, haunting melodies of the desert nomads. In this vast open space, the rigid, suffocating structures of the French court felt like a distant, faded dream of another life. She saw the glittering golden spires of Constantinople and the ancient, sun-bleached walls of Antioch. She tasted the dust of the world on her lips and found it more intoxicating than the finest wine in all of Paris. The crusade was a military failure, a tragedy of steel and blood, but for Eleanor, it was a profound spiritual awakening. She returned to Europe, not as a submissive, bored wife, but as a woman who had looked at the edge of the world and realized she was meant to rule everything her eyes touched. The return to France was the final, slow collapse of a hollow and broken marriage. The tension between the monk king and the rebel queen had become an unbridgeable chasm of silence and resentment. Eleanor did the unthinkable. She sought an annulment, a move so bold it threatened to undo the entire political map of the continent. She was 30 years old, at the absolute radiant height of her beauty and her formidable sharp intellect, and she was about to choose her own destiny in a world that allowed women no choices. As she rode away from the French court for the last time, the wheels of her carriage creaking in the damp air, her mind was already turning toward the north, toward a man who was as turbulent, as loud, and as ambitious as she was. The sun of Aquitaine was still burning in her blood, but a new, powerful storm was gathering over the cold gray waters of the English Channel. Her first story was ending in the fading light of the Parisian towers, but a much longer, much more epic loop was about to begin. She looked toward the gray sea, toward the jagged white cliffs of a new and wild kingdom, where a young lion was waiting to claim her hand and her empire. The horses are turning, the sails are unfurling in the salt wind, and the future is calling her name across the crashing waves of the channel. Stay with the rhythm of the waves as we follow her into the mist. As the grand white sails of Eleanor's fleet catch the steady northern gale, the searing golden heat of the east begins to fade into a distant memory of dust, sun, and spices. The horizon shifts slowly, almost imperceptibly, from the jagged, sun-bleached skylines of the Levant to the soft, rolling emerald hills of the English coast. We are moving away from the high-stakes drama and the burning sands of the Crusades and stepping into a landscape of constant mist, ancient moss, and deep, silent oak forests. Imagine the very air changing as you breathe. It is no longer dry and sharp against the throat, but heavy, cool, and thick with the grounding scent of damp earth and salt spray from the channel. This is the world of the Angevins, a realm defined by the gray, churning waters and the endless, quiet woodlands of Britain. The transition is like a cool, damp cloth pressed gently against a fevered brow. Your mind, which has been racing across the vast deserts of Antioch, now settles into the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the northern rain. We are grounding ourselves deeply in the dark soil of a new kingdom, where the stone is weathered, the grass is a deeper shade of green, and the entire pace of life is dictated by the slow, seasonal pulse of the tides and the rain. In this land of mist and shifting shadow, Eleanor found her true match in Henry II, a man who was less a traditional king and more a raw, unyielding force of nature. Together, they began to weave a massive tapestry of power that would become known to history as the Angevin Empire, a vast, sprawling stretch of land that reached from the wild borders of Scotland all the way down to the sun-shadowed Pyrenees. Imagine them together in a quiet hunting lodge, hidden deep within the heart of the New Forest, the stone walls lined with heavy dark firs to keep out the persistent chill of a late November evening. They were building more than just an empire of borders and taxes. They were building a home, a dynasty, and an entirely new way of being royal in a cold world. There is a strange, profound comfort in this era of construction, a feeling of deep foundations being laid into the cooling earth. You can hear the steady, rhythmic thud of the woodsman's axe echoing in the distance, and the soft, repetitive scratching of a monk's quill in a nearby scriptorium, recording the laws that would bind this new world together for generations. The chaos of Eleanor's turbulent past was being replaced by the solid, heavy reality of stone keeps, thick wool, and silver coins. It was a time of settling, of breathing deeply into the lungs, and of finding a rare safety in the strength of a shared, quiet ambition. There is a common hollow misconception that love in the Middle Ages was merely a cold, calculated business transaction, a soulless exchange of ancient land and dusty titles. And while it is as undeniably true that Eleanor and Henry's union was a masterpiece of political and territorial engineering, it was also something far more volatile and alive. Their relationship was a business transaction that caught fire in the dark. Beneath the formal treaties and the grand coronations, there was a raw, crackling energy, a fierce, intellectual, and physical passion that burned much brighter than any torch hanging in the hall. They were two suns orbiting the same center of gravity, their combined heat sustaining the life of an entire continent. This was the Angevin fire, a radiant warmth that provided a profound sense of security to their subjects, but carried a dangerous, flickering intensity within its core. It is a constant reminder that even in a world governed by rigid duty and cold stone, the human heart could still spark with a wild, unpredictable, and beautiful light. This warmth is what we feel now, like the deep, radiant heat from a great fireplace that has been burning for hours on end, reaching deep into your bones and telling your weary mind that for this brief, fleeting moment, everything is exactly as it should be. The world outside the lodge is silent and still, save for the persistent, gentle drumming of the rain against the leaded glass windows. Inside, the only sound is the rhythmic, soothing, and hypnotic crackle of the hearth fire. The logs, seasoned oak and sweet applewood, hiss and pop softly as the low blue flames lick the rough bark, releasing a scent that is both primal and profoundly domestic. Watch the embers as they shift and settle in the grate, turning from a vibrant, fierce orange to a soft, glowing, and powdery gray. This is the lull of the dynasty, the quiet, fertile period of growth where children are born into the purple, where castles are fortified against the wind, and the future feels like an endless golden road stretching through the mist. Your heartbeat slows further to match the steady tempo of the falling rain outside. The weight of the story is no longer a burden to carry. It is a warm, heavy blanket tucked tightly and securely around you. The mist outside the window acts as a soft veil, blurring the sharp edges of the world until there is nothing left but this small room, this glowing fire, and this feeling of absolute grounded safety. The lions of England are sleeping peacefully by the fire, their sharp claws tucked away, their breathing steady, rhythmic, and deep. But fire, by its very essence, is a living thing, and its fundamental nature is to consume whatever it touches. The very intensity that built the great Angevin Empire, the raw passion, the sharp intellect, the unyielding and iron will, began to turn slowly inward. A fire that is not carefully contained will eventually eat the very house that holds it and protects it. As the night deepens and the mist turns into a thick, impenetrable fog that clings to the trees, the warmth of the hearth starts to feel a little too heavy, a little too stifling against the skin. The silence of the ancient forest is no longer just peaceful. It is expectant and heavy, as if the trees themselves are waiting for the first crack of dry wood to turn into a terrifying roar of destruction. The love that once forged a vast kingdom is slowly transforming into a different kind of energy, a sharper, colder, and more bitter flame of resentment and betrayal. The light in the lodge is flickering low now, casting long, distorted, and dancing shadows of the lions against the cold stone walls. We are moving away from the safety of the fire and toward the long, cold winter of the soul. The mist is rising, the embers are cooling into ash, and the dream of a united empire is beginning to fray at the edges, caught in the sharp thorns of a crown that has grown too heavy to wear in peace. We follow the cooling trail into the darkness of the years to come. The world did not end with a scream for Eleanor, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a wooden bolt sliding into place. For a woman whose footprint once stretched from the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine to the dusty roads of Jerusalem, the sudden shrinking of the horizon was a violence of its own. 16 years. It is a number easily spoken, a mere heartbeat in the grand tapestry of history. But inside the Salisbury Tower, 16 years was a vast, silent ocean. The air here was different. It was heavy with the scent of old stone, floor rushes, and the lingering phantom of incense that never quite cleared. This was her new empire, a room of velvet and shadow, a prison designed not to break her bones, but to erode the very edges of her soul. Her husband, Henry, understood her better than any man ever had, and that was precisely why he was her most effective jailer. He did not chain her to a wall in a damp obliette. He knew that physical pain would only sharpen her resolve. Instead, he gave her silk. He gave her fine wine. He gave her the prison of velvet. It was a psychological masterpiece of cruelty surrounding a lioness with the comforts of a kitten to see if she would eventually forget the taste of blood and power. But Henry underestimated the terrifying patience of a woman who has already lived several lifetimes before her 40th year. In the beginning, the silence was a roar. Eleanor would pace the length of the chamber, her silk skirts hissing against the stone like a serpent in the grass. She would count the steps 12 paces from the window to the hearth, 8 paces from the bed to the heavy oak door. She would do this until her feet ached, trying to exhaust the restless energy of a queen who was used to commanding armies. But as the months bled into years, the pacing stopped. The stillness took over. She learned that to survive the tower, one must become the tower. She became a creature of observation, a scholar of the minute and the mundane. She spent a decade mastering the art of the needle. In the world outside, embroidery was a pastime for bored noblewomen, a way to pass a rainy afternoon. For Eleanor, it was a ritual of survival. Every stitch was a memory preserved. Every color of thread was a landscape she might never see again. She sewed the deep greens of the forests of Poitou into her tapestries. She used gold thread to capture the way the sun used to set over the Mediterranean. Sometimes she would prick her finger on purpose, just to feel the sharp, stinging reminder that she was still made of flesh and blood, not stone and silk. The rhythmic in-out of the needle became her heartbeat, a slow, steady pulse that kept her anchored when the isolation threatened to pull her into the gray mist of madness. She read. She read until the ink seemed to swim off the parchment and dance in the flickering candlelight. She surrounded herself with the songs of troubadours, the very men she had once patronized in her court of love. These poems were no longer just entertainment. They were lifelines. They reminded her that beauty existed, that passion was real, and that somewhere, beyond the thick stone walls and the watchful guards, men were still fighting for honor and poets were still dying for a kiss. She studied the histories of the Roman Empire, tracing the rise and fall of great men, finding a grim comfort in the fact that even the mightiest Caesar eventually turned to dust. She realized that Henry, for all his power and his locks, was also a prisoner of his own paranoia, a prisoner of a crown that was growing heavier with every rebellion. The reveal of her confinement lay in a singular chilling truth. Her husband feared her mind more than he feared any invading army. He knew that Eleanor was the architect of his son's discontent. He knew that even while locked away, her influence drifted through the cracks in the masonry like smoke. He feared the way she looked at him, not with hatred, which is a loud and messy emotion, but with a cold, analytical pity. He locked her away because he could not control her, and in his world, what could not be controlled had to be buried. Yet, you cannot bury the wind. You can only close the windows and hope the house holds together. As the middle years of her captivity arrived, the concept of time began to dissolve. There was no clock in Salisbury Tower, only the ticking of the seasons. She learned to tell the month by the angle of the light that hit the northern wall at noon. In winter, it was a pale, weak sliver that barely warmed the stone. In summer, it was a bold, golden bar that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, millions of tiny particles, free to drift wherever the draft took them. She envied those dust motes. She watched the seasons change through a narrow slit in the stone. She saw the trees lose their leaves, turning into skeletal fingers reaching for a gray sky. And then, with agonizing slowness, she saw the green fire of spring return to the branches. 16 times she watched the world die and be reborn, while she remained unchanged, a statue in a velvet shroud. The melancholy of those years was not a sharp pang, but a low, constant hum. It was the sound of a life being lived in the subjunctive mood, the what might have been, and the what could be. She missed her children with a hollow ache that no amount of prayer or poetry could fill. She wondered if they remembered the smell of her hair or the sound of her laughter, or if she had become a ghost to them too, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power. But then, the bridge began to form. Time, which had been her tormentor, slowly became her ally. The very thing Henry hoped would break her was actually tempering her. The fire of her youth was gone, replaced by a cold, hard diamond of intellect. While Henry aged and grew weary under the constant pressure of ruling a fractured empire, Eleanor was resting. She was gathering her strength. She was watching the board from a distance, seeing the moves he couldn't see because he was too close to the game. She realized that by locking her away, Henry had granted her a strange kind of immortality. She was no longer subject to the daily grind of politics. She was a symbol, a legend, a shadow that hung over his every decision. The prisoner was no longer waiting for a rescue. She was waiting for the inevitable. She knew the biology of power, that young men grow old, that old men die, and that those who have learned to sit still are the ones who inherit the earth. In the final years of her loop, the atmosphere in the tower changed. The guards, once stern and silent, began to look at her with a mix of awe and fear. They saw a woman who had outlasted the king's patience, a woman who seemed to grow more regal with every gray hair that appeared. The prison of velvet had failed. The walls were still there, the bolt was still thrown, but Eleanor was already gone. Her mind was already across the channel, already whispering in the ears of her sons, already preparing for the moment the heavy oak door would open, not for a meal, but for her release. When the end of the 16 years finally came, it wasn't with a crash, but with a hush. Henry was dead. The man who thought he could lock up the sun had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes and a fractured kingdom. Eleanor stepped out of the Salisbury Tower, blinking against the unaccustomed brightness of a world she hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades. She did not stumble. She did not weep. She simply smoothed her silk skirts, the ones she had mended 1,000 times in the dark, and began to rule. The prisoner had become the master, and the 16 years of silence had given her a voice that would echo through the centuries. The velvet was gone, only the steel remained. The heavy thud of the wooden bolt, a sound that had defined the narrow boundaries of her existence for 16 long years, finally echoed for the last time against the stone. But in that moment, as the iron groaned and the wood yielded, it did not sound like the end of a life. It sounded like the world itself was taking a long, deep, and overdue breath. King Henry II, the man who had been her husband, her fierce intellectual partner, and ultimately her stone-faced jailer, was gone. The news of his passing traveled through the cold, damp corridors of Salisbury Tower like a soft, cooling wind, smelling of rain and distant possibilities. As the heavy doors swung wide to reveal the gold of the afternoon sun, Eleanor of Aquitaine did not emerge as a broken relic of a forgotten age. She stepped into the light as a living legend, her spine as straight as a spear, her gaze as sharp as the day she first wore a crown. At nearly 70 years of age a time, when the medieval world expected a woman to be a shadow in a shroud, the lioness was not merely released. She was unleashed, rising from the dust of her confinement with a vitality that defied the very stars. There is a profound, quiet satisfaction in the act of outlasting. For Eleanor, this release was not a moment of frantic celebration or loud, boastful triumph. It was something far deeper, a centered strength that radiated from her like heat from an afternoon hearth. She did not need to scream her victory to the heavens. The simple, rhythmic sound of her boots on the gravel outside the tower was statement enough. The tension that had coiled in her chest for 16 winters, the suppressed fire that had burned in the silence of her velvet prison, began to unravel slowly, like a spool of silk caught in a gentle breeze. Her favorite son, Richard, the Lionheart, was now the king, and his first act from across the sea had been an echo of her own spirit. Set my mother free, and give her the power of the realm. She was no longer a prisoner of a husband's fear. She was the custodian of a son's empire. What followed was a feat that seemed to slow the very spinning of the earth. A woman of 70, in an age defined by the harshness of mud and the weight of iron, did not seek the comfort of a cushioned chair by a fireplace. Instead, Eleanor took to the saddle. She became a moving part of the landscape, a silver-haired specter of authority riding across the vast sweeping plains of Europe. She felt the rhythmic sway of the horse beneath her, a motion she had missed more than the taste of fine wine. She rode through the biting winds of the Channel and the sun-drenched valleys of France, her heavy cloak snapping behind her like a banner. She was not riding for the glory of conquest, but for the beauty of stability. From castle to castle, court to court, she moved with the grace of a woman who had mastered time itself. She acted as Richard's regent, her voice calm and unwavering as she settled the volatile spirits of rebellious barons. She moved through the world not as a ghost of the past, but as the only hand steady enough to hold the future together. There was a magnetic, almost supernatural quality to her presence in those final decades. Everywhere she traveled, the people looked upon her with a mix of awe and a quiet, reverent fear. They saw a woman who had survived everything the world could devise to break a human spirit crusades across burning sands. Scandalous whispers in the courts of kings, the bitter betrayals of blood, and the soul-crushing silence of a decade and a half in a single room. Her strength was no longer the fiery, impulsive passion of her youth that had once scandalized Christendom. It had matured into a quiet, immovable mountain. She moved with the effortless dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove to the living or the dead. Her eyes, clouded slightly by age, but bright with an undying intellect, reflected a wisdom that made even the most arrogant knights lower their gaze. This was the true return to safety, the satisfaction of a life that had moved through the storm and found the center of the calm. As she traversed the kingdoms of France, England, and Spain, a deeper, more permanent truth began to reveal itself in the wake of her horse's hooves. Eleanor was not merely a queen who had survived. She was the master architect of a new world order. She was becoming the grandmother of Europe, a title that carried more weight than any crown she had ever worn. With the same meticulous, patient care she had once used to stitch tapestries in the dim light of her tower, she began to weave the very DNA of the continent. Through the strategic marriages of her children and grandchildren, she placed her bloodline on every significant throne in the known world. She was the invisible thread connecting the warring houses of Europe, a quiet weaver of peace who understood that blood was stronger than ink, and that a well-placed marriage was more powerful than 1,000 siege engines. Every royal house that rose in the centuries to follow, every treaty that held back the tide of war, and every alliance that shaped the map of the world carried the hidden, indelible mark of her hand. She had turned her long years of isolation into a high vantage point, and from that silence, she had learned how to build an empire that transcended borders and outlived kings. Slowly, the frantic, thundering pace of her middle years began to yield to a gentler, more rhythmic pulse. The weight of her long, storied life, once a burden of grief and ambition that threatened to crush her, finally began to settle into a profound and lasting peace. There is a specific kind of spiritual sleepiness that comes when a great monumental task is nearing its completion, a feeling of the sun dipping below the horizon after a day of honest labor. Eleanor began to spend more and more of her time in the quiet, sacred cloisters of Fontevraud Abbey. It was a place of soft, shifting shadows and the low, hypnotic drone of chanting voices. Here, the air was always cool, smelling of ancient stone, beeswax candles, and the faint, sweet scent of dried herbs. She would sit for hours in the abbey gardens, her hands resting quietly in her lap, watching the shadows of the stone pillars stretch slowly across the grass as the day faded. The memories of her life, the sound of crusader trumpets in the desert air, the heated, brilliant arguments with Henry, the high-pitched laughter of her children in the halls of Poitiers, were no longer sharp thorns that drew blood. They had become like smooth, river-washed stones resting at the bottom of a clear, still stream, beautiful, heavy, and settled forever. She had done enough. She had outplayed the kings of the earth. She had raised empires from the dust, and she had walked through the heart of the darkness and come out the other side. The tension of the world, the clashing of swords, and the shouting of men felt infinitely far away now, a dull, distant hum that could no longer disturb the sanctity of her soul. In this long golden twilight of her existence, her breathing became slow and perfectly synchronized with the natural world around her. Each exhale was a deliberate release of a decade, a letting go of a struggle, a final surrender to the quiet strength that only comes to those who have finished the journey. The world was safe in her hands, and for the first time in 82 years, she allowed herself the luxury of simply being. The matriarch had ascended to a place where power and peace were no longer enemies, but the same quiet light. However, the great loop of history is never truly still, and the peace of one queen is often the hard-won prize of another's long-forgotten war. For while Eleanor found her quiet abbey and her settled bloodline, the very foundations of the crown she protected had been forged in a much hotter, more chaotic fire. Not all who wore the title of queen were granted the luxury of a velvet prison or the grace of a peaceful end in a garden of stone. Long before Eleanor sat in her tower, there was another who fought for the right to even be called a ruler, a woman of iron and ice, who knew that for a queen to find a moment of peace, she first had to master the brutal, unforgiving art of war. As Eleanor's story finally settles into the soft, eternal silence of Fontevraud, We must turn our gaze back through the thick mists of time to a different kind of struggle, to a woman who proved that the path to the throne is often paved with the very peace she was denied. Enter Matilda, the Lady of the English, the woman who refused to break when the world tried to bend her. The gentle, honeyed light of Eleanor's Abbey gardens begins to fade, replaced by a sharp, metallic tang in the air. The scent of lavender and ancient stone dissolves into the smell of wet iron, charred oak, and the relentless, biting chill of a winter that seems to have no end. We are stepping back through the heavy mists of time, leaving the era of the matriarch, to enter a world that was raw, fractured, and bone-deep in its exhaustion. This is the story of Matilda, the Empress who was promised a throne and given a 19-year war instead. It is a tale of a woman who refused to say the word no when the world tried to erase her name from the stone of history. This was the era of the anarchy, a time so hollow and cruel that the chroniclers of the day whispered to one another in the dark that Christ and his saints had fallen into a deep, unreachable sleep. The story begins with the hollow sound of a broken oath echoing across the English Channel. When the white ship sank into the frigid waves, taking the only male heir to the English throne with it, King Henry did something that set the world on fire. He made the proud, iron-willed barons of England swear fealty to his daughter, Matilda. They knelt before her. They placed their hands between hers and promised, on holy relics and by the blood of their ancestors, that she would be their lady and their queen. But the human heart is a fickle thing when faced with the cold reality of power. The moment the old king's heart stopped beating, those oaths evaporated like mist in a gale. Her cousin Stephen, moving with the desperate speed of an opportunist, snatched the crown and placed it upon his own head. In that single act of betrayal, the world tilted on its axis, and the long gray years of the anarchy began. But Matilda was not a creature built for retreat, or for the quiet submission that the barons expected. She had been an empress of the Holy Roman Empire. She had sat upon the highest thrones of Europe since she was a mere child. To her, the crown was not a gift to be granted, but a birthright that was part of her very marrow. She did not come across the sea as a supplicant or a victim. She came as a storm. She did not arrive to ask for what was hers. She came to take it back, stone by stone, castle by castle, and breath by breath. The landscape of these 19 years was a blurred, foggy montage of smoke and shadow. England became a vast frozen chessboard where the squares were made of thick mud and drying blood. The chronicles of this time do not speak of grand cinematic victories or the chivalry of knights in shining armor. Instead, they tell of a slow, grinding misery that settled over the land like a heavy, wet blanket. It was a time of adulterine castles jagged, lawless fortresses thrown up overnight by men who owed allegiance to nothing but their own greed and the sharp edge of their swords. Imagine the atmosphere of those years as a constant, low-hanging fog that never truly lifted. It smelled of wet wool, damp earth, and the lingering, acrid phantom of timber that had burned and cooled in the rain. The fields, once golden with wheat, lay fallow and gray, because the men who should have plowed them were either rotting in the earth or huddled in fear behind crumbling stone walls. The sun itself seemed to lose its strength, its light filtered through a permanent haze of wood smoke and winter mist. This was a war of endurance, a long, cold fever that refused to break, where time was measured not by months, but by the number of winters one managed to survive. The rhythm of life was reduced to the rhythmic, hollow thud of a battering ram against an oak door, and the endless, shivering nights spent in drafty, echoing halls where the only warmth came from a dying fire and the desperate hope of tomorrow. The peak of this high-stakes drama, the moment that defined the iron spirit of Matilda, occurred in the heart of the most bitter winter of 1142. She was trapped. She was besieged within the thick walls of Oxford Castle, surrounded by the massive, confident army of King Stephen. The food had long since run out. The firewood was nothing but piles of cold ash. Outside the walls, the River Thames had frozen into a solid, jagged sheet of gray ice, a barrier that seemed as impenetrable as the enemy lines. Stephen sat in his camp, warm and triumphant, waiting for the Empress to finally crawl out of the gates and beg for his mercy. He thought he had finally pinned the butterfly to the board. He thought the war was over. But Matilda understood a secret that the king did not. She understood the terrifying power of the invisible. On a night when the blizzard was so thick and the wind so fierce that a man could not see his own hand before his face, she prepared for her most daring move. She did not dress in her royal purple or her heavy silks. She did not carry a sword or a shield. Instead, she and 3 of her most loyal silent knights wrapped themselves from head to toe in plain white linen sheets. They lowered themselves from the high, frozen battlements of the castle by silken ropes, moving like ghosts against the dark stone. In the howling wind and the blinding, swirling white of the snowstorm, they became part of the landscape. They were nothing but shadows in a world of ice. They walked right through the enemy lines, passing so close to the sentries that they could hear the men stamping their feet and grumbling about the cold. But the guards, squinting into the stinging ice and the white darkness, saw nothing but the drifting snow. They saw only the wind. Matilda moved across the frozen river, her boots crunching softly on the ice, a white ghost vanishing into a white world. She fled for 6 miles on foot, through the teeth of a gale that would have killed a lesser soul. Each step was a battle against the numbness, a rhythmic, steady pulse of survival. In that moment, the high stakes of her rebellion softened into a visual of pure, crystalline peace. Imagine the silence of that walk. The world was stripped of its politics, its crowns, and its betrayals. There was only the muffled sound of footsteps on frozen crust, and the way her breath hung in the freezing air like a silver veil. For those few hours, she was neither an empress nor a rebel. She was simply a soul moving through a cathedral of winter, becoming one with the storm. This image of the white ghost in the blizzard is the lull in the center of the chaos. It is a scene that induces a heavy, wintry sleepiness, the feeling of being tucked under a thick, cold, white blanket, while the rest of the noisy, violent world simply disappears. The white-on-white canvas of the blizzard swallows the sounds of war, leaving only the steady, calming rhythm of a woman who refuses to stop walking. The anarchy did not end with a final, thunderous clash of steel or a grand surrender. It did not have a cinematic finale where the villain fell and the hero was crowned amidst cheering crowds. Instead, the long war ended because the world was simply too tired to keep its eyes open. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving only a bone-deep, collective exhaustion. The transition from war to peace came not with a bang, but with a weary, heavy sigh, and a handshake between 2 people who had forgotten why they started fighting in the first place. Matilda, with the wisdom that only comes from surviving 19 winters of fog and ice, made the ultimate tactical pivot. She realized that she might never wear the crown she had bled for, but she could ensure it belonged to her blood. She stopped fighting for her own seat on the throne and started fighting for her son's. In a quiet, drafty room, a handshake was exchanged. Stephen would remain king for the short remainder of his life, but Matilda's son, the future Henry II, would be his heir. The Iron Woman had bent her pride, but she had not broken her line. As the ink dried on the treaty, the great sleep of the saints finally came to an end. The fog began to lift from the English fields, and the sound of plows replaced the sound of swords. The story shifted from the chaos of the blizzard into the structured, legalistic brilliance of the Plantagenet dawn, the very world that Eleanor of Aquitaine would one day step into. But even in the height of that new empire's glory, when the sun shone brightest on the stone towers, people would still look at the falling winter snow and whisper about the white ghost. They would remember the woman who vanished into the storm and, in doing so, ensured that her story would never be buried under the ice. The war was over, the handshake was cold, and the long, white night of the anarchy finally faded into the soft, gray light of a new morning. The fog of the anarchy begins to lift from the English fields, but it does not reveal a world of modern clarity or sterile light. Instead, we step softly into the private, heavily curtained chambers of the high medieval court, where the air is a thick, dizzying cocktail of expensive perfumes, smoldering herbs, and the underlying unspoken scent of stone and decay. To truly understand the queens who moved empires and commanded armies, we must look beyond their crowns and into the rituals they performed behind closed doors, the strange, meticulous, and sometimes deadly art of the royal toilet. This was a world where beauty was not merely a matter of vanity, but a desperate daily shield against the encroaching shadows of a world that was often brutal, unwashed, and tragically short-lived. It is an immersion into a sensory paradox, the feel of the finest silk resting against skin treated with poison, and the fragrance of crushed roses competing with the stark reality of the world just beyond the castle walls. The first thing you would notice in the dim amber light of a queen's dressing room is the profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic sharp snip of silver tweezers. In this era, the height of feminine beauty was not a natural sun-kissed glow, but a high, expansive, and almost ethereal forehead that suggested a noble, intellectual spirit far removed from the toil of the earth. To achieve this strange beauty, noble women would endure hours of silent agony, systematically plucking the hair from their hairlines, inch by inch, day after day, until their foreheads reached the very crown of their heads. They would even pluck their eyebrows into total oblivion, leaving a face that looked like a smooth, pale, and perfect egg-blank canvas of aristocratic purity that seemed to glow in the candlelight. It is a haunting, hypnotic image, a woman sitting perfectly still for hours, while her attendants strip her of the very features we consider essential today, all to meet a standard of elegance that felt almost alien, a mask of flesh that signaled she was a being of spirit and status, far removed from the sun-darkened, hairy reality of the common peasantry. As the morning ritual progressed, the queen would step into a heavy, deep wooden tub lined carefully with soft linen to protect her delicate skin from the rough splinters of the oak. This was the rosewater bath, a luxury so immense that few in the world could even dream of it. The water was warm, infused with dried lavender, crushed rose petals, and thick, expensive oils brought by weary traders from the distant, fabled East. For a long, suspended moment, as she submerged herself in the floral steam, the world felt clean and holy. The steam rose in slow, lazy spirals toward the vaulted ceiling, carrying the scent of a paradise garden into the drafty, cold stone chamber. But this was the great medieval illusion, a beautiful lie told in the dark. While the queen soaked in her floral infusion, just outside the heavy iron-bound oak doors, the reality of the castle was a different story entirely. Open sewers ran like dark, sluggish rivers through the courtyards, and the rushes on the floors of the great halls were often a rotting, damp carpet of old food, spilled ale, and animal waste that had not been changed in months. The rosewater bath was a fragile bubble of sensory denial, a ritual performed in quiet defiance of a world that was fundamentally filthy. Every drop of scented water was a small, silent rebellion against the stench of the Middle Ages, a way to convince oneself that within these thick stone walls, one was closer to the angels than to the dust of the earth. The most chilling and fascinating reveal of the royal toilet, however, lay in the small, ornate ceramic jars that sat like jewels upon the silver dressing table. To achieve the deathly ethereal pallor that was the absolute fashion of the day, these women turned to a pharmacopoeia of beautiful poisons. They would coat their faces, necks, and shoulders in ceruse, a thick, heavy paste made of white lead and sharp vinegar. It gave the skin a smooth, porcelain finish, hiding the deep scars of smallpox and the inevitable wear of age under a layer of artificial snow. But as the lead sat upon the skin, it slowly and silently seeped into the pores, poisoning the very blood it was meant to beautify. They would drop the juice of the belladonna lily into their eyes to dilate their pupils, giving them a wide-eyed, shimmering look of perpetual excitement, unaware that they were slowly blurring their vision into a permanent gray fog. They used mercury to treat skin blemishes, creating a terrifying cycle of toxicity that eroded their health, even as it seemingly perfected their image. They were painting themselves with the very elements of their own destruction, using the metals of the earth to create a mask of health that was, in reality, a slow and gilded suicide. It is a fascination rooted in the macabre idea that to look truly royal, one had to flirt daily with the graveyard. In the center of this long ritual, there was always a lull, a moment of profound, heavy stillness, where the world seemed to stop breathing. Imagine the queen sitting before a polished silver mirror, her face a white mask of lead, her eyes wide and dark from the lily. The only sound in the room is the slow, hypnotic dripping of water from a silver ewer into a wide basin. Drip. 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 Dite. The sound is rhythmic and constant, like the ticking of a phantom clock that hasn't been invented yet. It is the sound of time itself leaking away, one scented drop at a time, echoing against the silver and the stone. In this deep stillness, the toxic weight of the lead and the stench of the world outside fade into a heavy, meditative fascination. You realize that these women were not just being vain. They were performing a sacred ceremony of the self. They were decorating a temple that they knew was under constant, invisible siege. The medicine of the time was no less bizarre, a strange blend of poetry and terror. When the lead poisoning, or the damp cold of the castle walls inevitably brought on a fever, the cure was often more frightening than the disease itself. They believed in the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and to stay healthy, one had to be drained of the excess. Physicians would apply dark, heavy leeches to the queen's pale, lead-whitened arms, watching in silence as the creatures grew turgid with her life force. They would prescribe Deriac, a mysterious and ancient concoction containing dozens of secret ingredients, including ground-up bits of dried vipers and crushed emeralds, believing that the rarer the substance, the more potent the magic. It was a medical philosophy based on the stars and the humors rather than the blood, a desperate attempt to read the language of the body using a broken and beautiful alphabet. These daily rituals, the plucking of the brow, the heavy coating of leaden paint, the rosewater baths, and the rhythmic bloodletting, were the only shields these queens possessed against the ever-present shadow of death that haunted every corridor. In an age where a simple scratch from a rose thorn, or a sudden chill in the night air, could end a dynasty, the toilet was a form of psychological armor. It was the only way to maintain control over the one kingdom they truly owned, their own physical bodies. The bridge between the height of beauty and the coldness of the grave was shorter than a heartbeat, and every single morning, as the queen looked into her polished silver mirror, she was preparing herself for a war that could not be won with swords or armies, but only with the defiant, poisoned elegance of a woman who still looked like the death that was waiting for her just outside the door. As we leave the scented, toxic air of the chamber, the dripping of the water in the silver basin fades into the background, a heartbeat that reminds us that even the most beautiful mask eventually falls. The rituals were complete. The queen was painted in white and rose, and she was ready to step out once more into a world where life was a flickering candle, and the only way to keep the flame alive was to surround it with a wall of velvet, lead, and the lingering scent of crushed flowers. The heavy scented fog within the queen's private chamber begins to thicken and change, no longer the floral steam of a rosewater bath or the toxic white dust of leaden paint, but a heavy somber mist that rolls in from the cold gray sea. We are now moving away from the vanity of the polished silver mirror and toward the deep, encroaching reality of the bloodline. In the high medieval world, a crown was never just a heavy piece of gold. It was a fragile, flickering candle flame held desperately against the howling of a hurricane. To be a queen or a king was to live in a perpetual state of quiet, bone-deep terror, not necessarily of invading armies or the clashing of swords, but of the sudden, silent snapping of a single genealogical thread. This was the obsession that haunted every midnight prayer whispered in the dark, every strategic royal marriage, and every silent corridor of power. The desperate, agonizing need for an heir, a physical vessel made of flesh and bone to carry the family name forward into an uncertain and flickering future. The tragedy that defines this heartbreaking fragility more than any other in the annals of history is the lingering ghost of the white ship. Imagine, if you will, a cold, moonlit night in the late autumn of the year 1020. The air is crisp and biting, and the harbor of Barfleur is filled with the echoing sound of laughter, the clinking of silver goblets, and the rhythmic splashing of heavy oars against the dark water. The white ship was the finest, fastest vessel of its age, carrying the entire hope of the English throne, William Adelin, the only legitimate son and heir of King Henry I. The ship was filled with the young, the beautiful, and the most powerful of the realm, all drinking and dancing under the stars as the white sails caught the sudden wind. But in a single sickening moment of human error and hidden, jagged rocks, the ship struck the stone. The laughter turned to frantic screams, and then, slowly, to a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the entire ocean. By the first light of dawn, the air was gone, taken by the tide. A century of careful royal planning, of bloody conquests and brilliant marriages, was wiped clean by a few inches of rock and a swell of cold, dark water. When the news finally reached the king, it was said that he never smiled again for the rest of his life. The throne was suddenly a hollow thing, a heavy chair sitting over a vast void, because the blood had simply stopped flowing. This is the somber, heavy reality of the Middle Ages that we must face as the night grows longer. The realization that a single storm, a single night of drunken navigation, or a single misstep could undo the work of countless generations. A king could command 10,000 knights, he could build stone cathedrals that touched the very clouds, and he could write laws that governed the lives of millions. But he was ultimately, utterly powerless against the whims of the elements and the fragility of life. The bloodline was a thin, golden chain, and every single link was forged in the long shadow of potential catastrophe. We often think of these ancient empires as solid, immovable structures made of stone and iron, but they were actually as delicate as the fine lace on a queen's sleeve, liable to tear at the slightest pull of fate. The body of this history is not found in the dates of great battles, but in the quiet, terrified waiting of a mother for a child to take its first breath. It is the story of queens who spent their entire lives in a state of high-stakes biological warfare, their very bodies treated as political territory to be managed and guarded. Every pregnancy was a dangerous gamble with death, and every sudden fever was a potential apocalypse for a dynasty. The true reveal of this era is that a king's greatest enemy was never the sword of a rival or the treachery of a rebellious baron. His true executioner was the microscopic, the invisible, and the mundane. A sudden chill in the bones, a tainted cup of water from a summer well, or a lingering fever could decapitate a kingdom more effectively than any executioner's axe ever could. The crown did not protect the head from the heat of a virus. The heavy purple robes did not shield the heart from the slow, inevitable stopping of a pulse. In the very center of this somber reflection, as the light of our journey begins to dim, we find a profound and heavy lull moment where all the ambition, the greed, and the noise of history fall away, leaving only the slow, rhythmic tolling of a distant cathedral bell. Bong, 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 wing. The sound is deep, resonant, and incredibly slow, vibrating in the very marrow of the earth and the stones of the walls. It is a sound that marks the passing of a soul, but it also marks the passing of time itself, steady and indifferent. It is a hypnotic, heavy rhythm that invites your eyelids to grow heavier with every strike, and your breath to find a steady, calm, and natural pace. With every deep strike of the bell, the names of the great kings and the powerful queens seem to dissolve into the cool night air, becoming nothing more than faint vibrations in the growing silence. The bells do not care for the gold of the crown or the length of the lineage. They only know the steady, inevitable march toward the end of the day. The sun is finally setting on the Middle Ages, casting long, deep purple shadows across the landscape of our mind. The fierce wars of Matilda, the poisoned elegance of Eleanor, and the white ghosts of the winter blizzard are all beginning to settle into the dark earth, turning into the quiet mulch of memory and dream. We are left now with a sense of heavy, peaceful melancholy. The fragility of the bloodline reminds us that everything built by human hands is temporary, a sandcastle waiting patiently for the rising tide. But in that very temporality, there is a strange and beautiful comfort, a permission to finally let go of the struggle, the ambition, and the constant noise of the world. As the light fades to a deep bruised indigo, we look one last time at the legacy left behind. It is not a legacy of borders or maps or stone buildings, but a legacy of human spirit and endurance. The bloodlines may have frayed, and the golden crowns may have long since melted away, but the stories remain, woven into the very fabric of the silence. We are moving now toward the final bridge of our long journey, crossing over from the world of the living into the world of the eternal and the still. The transition is soft and effortless, like the falling of a single leaf onto the surface of a perfectly still pond. We are no longer looking at the queens as rulers or as icons, but as fellow travelers who have finally, after a long and weary road, found their perfect rest. The bells continue to toll, slower now, more distant, and more muffled, as we prepare to leave the Middle Ages behind and settle into the deep, dark, and unwavering peace of the long night ahead. The shadows are long, the air is cool, and the journey is finally beautifully complete. The heavy iron-tongued bells of the great silent cathedrals have finally faded into the absolute stillness of the English night, their echoes swallowed by the soft, damp earth and the deep, reaching roots of ancient oaks. We are leaving the corridors of power behind us now, stepping out from the vaulted stone halls, the whispered conspiracies, and the poisoned leaden elegance of the royal toilette. The long journey through the centuries is drawing to its natural, inevitable close, and the air here is no longer sharp with the metallic, biting scent of winter or heavy with the cloying, sweet perfume of crushed roses. It is the scent of the twilight itself, cool, neutral, and profoundly, deeply still. It is the scent of stone that has seen the sun set 1,000 times, and the scent of rain that has washed away the dust of empires. Imagine you are walking now through the ruins of a castle as it stands in the present day, a skeleton of silver-gray stone, reaching tentatively toward a modern silent sky. The grand, vibrant tapestries that Eleanor of Aquitaine once meticulously stitched are gone, dissolved long ago by the slow, patient teeth of time and the damp breath of the shifting seasons. The heavy iron bolts that Matilda once heard thudding into place with such finality have rusted into nothingness, returning to the iron-rich soil from which they were first forged by fire and hammer. There is no more thud of the bolt, no more hiss of the silk, only the soft, rhythmic sigh of the wind moving through the empty window frames, where queens once looked out at their world. Everywhere you look, the ivy is winning its slow, quiet war. It climbs the jagged, broken edges of the ramparts with a persistent green grace, its tiny, delicate tendrils finding every microscopic crack and every ancient flaw in the master mason's work. The stone, once so formidable, so cold and so exclusionary, is now softened by a thick, emerald carpet of moss. It is a beautiful, silent surrender. These walls, which once held the most dangerous secrets of empires and the whispered, frantic fears of queens, are now home only to the nesting birds and the rhythmic low hum of the evening wind. There is a profound, philosophical detachment in this sight, a realization that the history we have traveled through together is not a solid wall, but a long, beautiful, and slowly fading dream. The desperate struggle for the crown, the gnawing fear of the bloodline, the intricate and toxic rituals of beauty, they have all been smoothed over by the passage of 800 years, like sharp, jagged stones worn down into soft, round pebbles by the constant, gentle pulsing of a deep and ancient river. The gold is gone now. The crowns have long since been melted down, their bright jewels scattered to the winds or locked away in dark velvet boxes, forever separated from the warm foreheads they once made so heavy with the weight of responsibility. The velvet of the prison is literal dust, scattered to the four corners of the world by the very same winds that once blew through the narrow arrow slits of Salisbury Tower. Even the names of the kings and the nameless peasants who serve them have begun to blur and merge in the great, gray, and peaceful expanse of the distant past. In this final phase of our journey, we find ourselves letting go, unloading the facts, the dates, the maps, and the specific, anxious faces of the powerful. They are no longer rulers to be studied or figures to be feared, but parts of the very earth upon which we walk. Their fierce ambitions, their midnight terrors, and their brief, shining triumphs have become the quiet mulch of the forest floor, the steady and silent foundation upon which the modern world rests its weary feet. They have returned to the silence, and we are returning with them. There is a profound reveal hidden in the settling of the dust, in the heart of the deep night, when the candles are finally extinguished and the noise of the world is hushed into a whisper. The king and the peasant finally become one. Beneath the heavy, comforting weight of sleep, they sleep, dream the exact same dreams. They feel the same coolness of the night air against their skin. They hear the same rhythmic, steady pulse of their own hearts, and they eventually find the same absolute, unwavering peace of the dark. The crown does not grant a deeper rest. The rags do not make the night any longer or more difficult. In the end, we are all just weary travelers seeking a safe place to lay our heads, and the history of the Middle Ages is simply the story of a very long, very loud day that has finally, mercifully, come to its end. The sun has set, the work is done, and the dust is still. The world is growing very quiet now. The shadows are deepening, turning from gray to indigo, from indigo to a soft, velvet black. The pauses between my words are becoming longer, like the spaces between the trees in a dark, ancient forest. Each word is a leaf falling onto the water, floating away into the dark. The cycle of history, with all its fire and its iron, is ultimately just a long, quiet night. We see the legacy not in the monuments of stone, but in the silence that follows them. It is the silence of the abbey at Fontevraud, after the very last chant has been sung. It is the silence of the blizzard at Oxford after the white ghost has safely passed through the lines and vanished into the cold. It is the silence of your own breath as it slows, finding its way back to the steady, natural, and ancient rhythm of the earth itself. Breath in, breath out. Slow, dot, steady, deep, deep. There is nothing left for you to hold on to. The stories have been told. The queens have found their rest, and the dust of kings has settled into the cracks of the floor. The heavy weight of the past has been unloaded from your mind, piece by piece, until only the abstract remains: the feeling of cool stone, the sound of the wind, and the deep, dark indigo of a sky without stars. You are drifting now, crossing the final bridge, moving away from the light of the fire and into the soft, velvet embrace of the dark. This story does not truly end. It merely settles into the quiet corners of the mind, waiting to be breathed back into life at another time. It is an unending reverie, a cycle that repeats in the hearts of those who choose to listen, those who find beauty in the shadows and wisdom in the silence. The spirits we have encountered, the lionesses, the empresses, the ghosts in the snow, they do not vanish when the voice fades. They simply wait. They wait in the stillness. They wait in the dark. They wait because tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, a new king or a new queen will rise in our tales. There are always more crowns to be forged, more towers to be built, and more secrets to be uncovered in the velvet dark of history. The journey we have taken today is but one thread in a tapestry that has no edge, a single loop in a chain that stretches back to the beginning of time and forward into the dreams of the future. But for now, that tapestry is folded away. The chain is still. As you hover here, in the soft space between waking and the deep, you realize a quiet truth. You are the chronicler now. You carry these spirits within you. They find a home in your dreams, moving through the landscapes of your subconscious, their voices echoing in the rhythmic pulse of your own rest. You are the guardian of the memory, the one who keeps the flame of the past alive by letting it settle into your soul. You are safe. You are at peace. You are home. Now, take a deep, slow breath. Feel the air fill your lungs, deep and steady, and let it out with a long, slow, effortless sigh. Again, breathing in the stillness and breathing out the world. You are becoming part of the story, a silent witness to the greatness of the ages. And when you are ready to return, when you crave the scent of the rosewater or the chill of the winter gale once more, the journey will be waiting for you. The reverie is yours to command. The history is yours to keep. For now, let the loop close gently, knowing that the beginning is always just a breath away. The words are no longer needed, for the silence has taken hold. Everything that needed to be said has been whispered into the dark. Every crown has been laid down. Every sword has been sheathed. Every castle door is locked, and every fire is reduced to glowing embers. The air around you is cool and still, a perfect sanctuary. Feel the incredible safety of your bed, the way the blankets cradle you, shielding you from the world outside. The weight of sleep is no longer a concept. It is a physical presence, a warm, heavy blanket of its own that is settling over your limbs, pulling you down into the soft, welcoming void of peace. There is nothing left to do. No more kings to follow. No more maps to trace. No more queens to save. The burden of thought has been lifted, leaving your mind as clear and as dark as the midnight sky. There is only the sensation of drifting, of floating on a calm black sea, where the waves are made of silk and the stars are reflected in the stillness. You are sinking deeper into the feathers, deeper into the dark, deeper into the peace that has no end. Surrender to it. Surrender to the weight. And surrender to the dark. Sleep now. Rest point. Sleep. I. Sleep. Sleep. Point.